Hello, everybody. Welcome to ELNET's Monday International Briefing. I'm Mark Sachs, Regional Director at ELNET. I'm going to dispense with some of the headlines today, though there are many to discuss. I think we'll figure out a way to subsume them into today's discussion. Very excited to introduce Zineb Riboua to everybody. Zineb is a research fellow with the Hudson Institute Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. She's incredibly accomplished. I'm not going to read her entire bio, but let me say this, Zineb, I cannot praise your writing enough. Your mastery of political and social philosophy, your understanding of history, and the way you approach integrating those things into your current event analysis is exceptional. And I recommend everybody go to zinebriboua.com because, again, Zineba has just a very interesting way of looking at world events. And I'm excited and looking forward to discussing them with her today. So, Zineb, welcome to ELNET and to our briefing.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the very generous and a very kind introduction, and a pleasure to discuss with you.
So I may be one of few who know who you are. So I think a great way to start would be for you to take a moment to just tell us the Zineb Riboua story. Where did you come from? Why did you choose this field? And how did you end up at Hudson Institute?
So I'm originally from Morocco. I grew up there. I did my high school there, and then I decided that I was going to go to France for studies. So I did my preparatory classes, and then I joined a Grand École program in France with the HEC Business School. And so I stayed there, and then I realized that I was not meant for investment banking or consulting, and I was more of a writer, and that I say too much what I think. And so
So you didn't like
I,
making money is basically what
yeah,
you're getting to.
I guess there are
Save the
different
world
ways,
over
right?
making money.
So I thought, why not just uh, take a program on international affairs. So I went to Cambridge University during the summer, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought, why not just continue on this path? So I came to the United States in 2020 for an internship. I really enjoyed it. I was doing Middle East issues at the time as well. I was very much interested in what China was doing in North Africa and the Middle East. And from that, I joined a grad school program at Georgetown. And afterwards, I just started writing for Jerusalem Post and other outlets. And that's how I ended up at Hudson. I applied the moment I saw a job application. I really am aligned with Hudson's mission, as well as how it sees the world. I thought it was the best institution to join, and I'm very grateful to work here today. So
Well,
that's
I'm
in a
glad you
nutshell.
found Hudson. I discovered you really because of some research I was doing when I was interviewing Mike Duran, and
Oh,
that's where I started reading your work and was really quite impressed. So I think you are you're the next crop of influential analysts out there, and so today it's going to be an interesting tour de force of topics. We're going to discuss great power competition. I know you've written about that, decolonial framework and third worldism, which I think is really quite interesting. Their impacts on the U.S., Europe, and Israel, and the shifting alliances. So there's no better place to start, I think, and it happens to be the current event of the week, if not the month right now, and that's Iran. If the regime falls, it's likely to be the most consequential event since 1979. I think it probably is even bigger than the fall of the Berlin Wall, just given how extensive Iran is throughout the world. Now, and it also, to me, Iran is the crossroads or sits at the crossroads of all of these things we've just been discussing, or we will discuss the great power competition, BRICS, decolonialization, and third worldism. It's all running through Iran. So there are conflicting reports. Trump is or is not going to take action. Trump is engaging in negotiations or not. How are you looking at Iran right now? And what are some of the most important things we really need to keep our eyes on as this continues to progress?
I completely agree with you in your description of the landscape and how much the Islamic Republic is central to that. I would say that I take a very different approach to many of my colleagues, and I am a little bit more optimistic about a U.S. intervention in this case, precisely because there's a pattern of Trump's behavior itself. Whenever he actually enforces a red line, he follows through. And it seems that this time, he set a clear red line, which is that Khamenei should not shoot the protesters, and he did. And on top of that, he was shutting down the internet, trying to hide the mass killings to the point where hospitals are now overwhelmed, etc. And so I do think that we need to take into consideration the fact that Trump has always had a problem with this regime, despite talking about a deal, etc. The way Trump emphasizes deal making and business deals, etc. It's very different from how Obama does it. There is no type of concessions that can be made. Trump needs to be the winner in it, and by that, America needs to be the winner in it. And this is very different from how Iran has always conducted its diplomacy and negotiations with the United States. So I'm still inclined to think that we should wait for a U.S. intervention. It can be, the United States hitting, for example, maybe the top, but it can also be the Basij forces, the IRGC forces. It can be more sanctions because I think that the sanctions themselves are extremely important and they contributed a lot to what is happening today because they've been enforced. Enforcement of sanctions is extremely crucial. There was the maximum pressure campaign under Trump administration one, but now under the second Trump administration, they've been built up because with what the Islamic Republic did is that to evade the sanctions, they found a way to explore shadow banking, to explore new channels, running through Turkey, running through the UAE in Dubai, running through Hong Kong. And the Trump administration just absolutely eliminated a lot of those loopholes by targeting them directly. So the Islamic Republic is running out of cash, I would say, and it's very difficult for them now to mobilize assets to deal with structural issues. So this is basically my take when it comes to U.S. foreign policy thinking. When it comes to understanding what is happening and what one should keep in mind is that Khamenei is in a very, very different and difficult position than ever for three reasons. The first one is that Israel, through the 12-day war, completely eliminated and paralyzed the chain of command, and that's extremely crucial because it never happened before. The fact that Israel was able to do that mission only means that there was a level of intel gathering and spying and elite defection that happened so that they can get that information. It's impossible to do that type of operation
Mhm.
without human intelligence. So it means that there's a crack somewhere. The second thing is that these protests are very different from previous protests for three reasons. The first one is that there is a huge water crisis in Iran right now that the government is not dealing with. And they're ignoring it, and they don't understand that the more they ignore it, the less likely it will go away. In fact, it will only make the case for either a new government or a regime overthrow, and that the amount of the water short. I mean, they can't sustain the water shortages this long, especially for regions that are very poor, like Sistan, Baluchistan, where there are also separatists. So this is the water shortage issue is very important, I believe. The second problem that I see is a problem of legitimacy and also of credibility. The fact that Khamenei was not able to rescue Hezbollah and Nasrallah from Israel's operations just means that he he lost the deterrence effect he had. And I think that's extremely important because they've always relied on Hezbollah for their foreign policy, but also for domestic reasons, for the money and also arms smuggling, etc. So I would say that the Islamic Republic, as it is today, its nature and also structure is very different, much weaker. The third reason why I think that Khamenei is losing credibility and is actually reaching a point of no return is that this new generation of Iranians, as we've seen with the Mahsa Amini protests, are completely alienated, and they simply do not adhere to the regime. And it's very difficult to maintain an Islamic republic like that actually relies on indoctrination and a lot of training and a lot of recruitment of Iranians so that they can sustain the proxies. So I think that the link there is broken, and that's very important, I believe, because it means that no matter how coercive the regime is and is going to be towards the protesters, it will simply not have that deterrent effect. I see that from more of a Machiavelli point of view, where the worst thing you can do as a leader is that whenever you repress people, you don't repress them, very short, very precise manner. You just repress anyone, but it doesn't prevent rebellion. And it's very noticeable right now that with the mass shootings and massacres and brutality, the rebellion is still there. Um, and this is a very, I think, important political and structural failure of Khamenei. So this
So
is, in a
Zineb,
nutshell, what I.
do you think that the rebellion as it's currently constituted, which is million to millions of people in 140 cities, do they have the critical mass and the energy driving that to withstand the time it's now taking for President Trump to determine what to do? In other words, is there a point at which they run out of energy and Trump is not capable of taking action?
The thing is, there's definitely a time problem, a timeline issue. We don't know when Trump will take action, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But what matters is that the sense of rebellion is there so that whenever Trump takes action, it will be revived. Because the economic situation and the social situation is so bad that for an average Iranian, going to the street and getting shot just it does not change much. I mean, they cannot really travel, they cannot really say what they think, and they know that the regime is against them. So I think that's a very, I think, subtle difference I would make. The I think that's a very difficult situation because of the brutality, but as I said, the whole point of brutality is that you dissuade them from going more. And from what I've seen yesterday, I think more than 20 mosques destroyed, IRGC officers killed by thousands. Something is just not working there for Khamenei.
So, it's almost hard not to examine Trump's extraction of Maduro through the
Yeah.
same lens of great power competition. Venezuela was the pipeline for illicit financing, illicit drugs, illicit oil, for a key base for Hezbollah, for both Iran and China. And so the extraction of Maduro raised a number of questions. And I'd like to pose what I view as the two polar ends of the argument and get a sense of where you think we are. On one argument is he's asserting American power in a way that helps reset the use of power to uphold the world order, almost akin to Roosevelt and Truman coming out of World War II to establish a new Pax Americana and reset a world order. The other side argues that he's acting more like a mafia don, that he within, like the Trump corollary within our Western Hemisphere, he determines what international law is. He's going to illustrate that might is right, and likewise lends credence to Putin in that part of the world and then Xi in that part of the world. Those to me strike me as the two extremes. Might is right, and we've got a new world order, or this is perhaps resetting the world order in a more favorable way. How do you see Trump's actions?
Um, I I think yes, this depiction of authoritarian regimes and that Trump is authoritarian that way, I think gets something very wrong in there for a very simple reason that Maduro has always worked against Western interests, U.S. interests, to the point where China and Russia, for a good reasons, obviously saw him as an outpost and a vassal state in Latin America, which, from a pure geopolitical point of view, is absolutely absurd to allow when you are thinking of competing with China and the greater rivalry of this century against China. And so I think that because international law was simply not enough to prevent Maduro's wrongdoings, the UN was always blocking and vetoing every single action against Maduro. In fact, it at this point most of the time works for Chinese and Russian interests, where and the United States has enough, I think, legal grounding to pursue and to go after Maduro. So I think that this idea that international law order is being fractured, actually, I think that Trump is more actually working in favor of establishing norms and standards, because that's what I think Pax Americana means, and what an American U.S.-led order means. It means that someone somewhere needs to actually enforce those standards. So this is how I see it. Obviously, there's a big problem where it comes to understanding Putin and also Trump. I mean, so far, whatever is in Syria, Venezuela, also in the Middle East, um, going after I would say the Russians when it comes to banking, but also in terms of their transactions. So far, every single action that Trump is doing is weakening Putin, especially in Syria. I think that gets always lost. I think people miss the great gain that the Trump administration is doing in Syria, because it's for the first time that Americans are actively working in the Levant. For a very long time,
Mhm.
it was very hostile powers, and Iranians had it as a backyard, and the Russians were using it for logistic reasons. And this time, there is actually a real thinking about how to make sure that Putin does not use that as an asset. And it's the same thing, I think, in Venezuela. And I think we're going to see a little bit more of that. And in fact, the great deterrence effect that this had was that in Nicaragua, right after they said that they're going to release prisoners, political prisoners. So I would say that, in fact, the deterrence effect is there. And this is why I believe that Khamenei is making similar mistakes as Maduro, because what happened was that there were talks, there were negotiations, and Maduro started provoking Trump. He was making fun of him. He said, "Come get me." He started singing John Lennon and all of these songs. And Khamenei is doing something very similar. He's saying that Trump is going to be like the Pharaoh and some other leaders. He's going to fall again. And he made another post last night, also provoking Trump and going across in the red line. So I think that there's always a logic to what Trump does when it comes to always hitting when his credibility is being questioned.
Yeah, if you go onto Twitter, you find everyone has an opinion. It's almost impossible to know what direction this is going to go. You mentioned, I want to turn to Europe now because you're I have and you have been discussing international law and the role of international law. You had a wonderful essay post Maduro where you discussed international law and sort of the way it has atrophied over time, perhaps, if that's a good word. Let me read something you wrote, and then I'll ask my question. So you wrote in that essay, quote, "For decades, American power absorbed the costs and risks of deterrence, escalation, and enforcement, while European states focused on integration, law, and institutional governance. This division of labor gradually transformed legal restraint into a moral identity. Because Europe was rarely required to act decisively, legality could be treated as an absolute rather than as a tool tested under pressure. American action, by contrast, came to appear destabilizing precisely because it exposed the gap between legal ideas and the realities of an enforcement that Europe itself no longer confronted." Now, reading that essay, I couldn't help but think if I replaced the United States with Israel, we could make very many of the same arguments. International law, the world order got hijacked by despots, autocrats, theocrats, and some of the worst human violators in the world. International law became this sort of sclerotic bureaucracy that maintained the status quo, regardless of who it helped and who it hurt. So, my question with regard to Europe is, do you think Trump's actions now, because you've argued going into Venezuela may reestablish the international law or supports it. Do you think that Western Europe's self-examination of what they've done wrong or right will be impacted by his actions? And then if yes or no, if yes, what do you think that would look like to European countries?
I mean, in terms of the legal reasoning.
The way that they view their role in the world, they have become so stagnant, so legalistic and moralistic that they're afraid to take action. And as a result, it seems the world order seems to support people like Maduro, people like the regime in Iran, people like Putin, that they're afraid to take actions because they're more concerned about holding the status quo than they are about upholding international law. And do you think that Trump's assertion in this regard will force them to take account of their positions?
Yes, I think that there is already a debate in Europe right now, from what I can tell in Italy and France and other places, because the main point that Trump is making that is that all these legal processes and all these legal authorizations and the process being the policy and the political result that one should always aim for is just not working. I think that there's a debate that way. However, I think that there is a fundamental mismatch when it comes to understanding that authoritarian regimes do not really respond to legal process um, and to um, and to all these declarations and diplomatic gestures. At the end of the day, I think it's about a balance of power. It's about having the means and the will to enforce norms and standards. And Europe, for historical reasons that I explained in that piece, but also because of a severe hijacking of the European mind with decolonization ideology, they fundamentally believe that any Western usage of power can only be evil. That applies also to Israel, that Israel is fundamentally evil, ontologically, the great Satan, and therefore whatever Israel does should be seen as evil, but also as illegal. And it's funny because they always make the argument that therefore international law should restrain Israel, but they also do not believe that international law is great either, since they think that international law is a byproduct of Western imperialism, of US imperialism, etc. And so I think that this forces a huge shift when it comes to European strategic thinking. And what I would argue is that at this point, there's just no escape to that. I mean, Russia is in the neighborhood massacring Ukrainians, and Europeans will have at some point or another change their way of thinking and adjust to the realities that are not too far from them.
Before I ask my next question, I want to remind everybody, feel free to submit a question if you have one, and we'll be asking them, or I'll be asking them in a little bit. So you've mentioned decolonial framework. Let's discuss that a little bit, because I don't know that many people on the call are familiar with the term, or maybe not even familiar with the term third worldism. So my first question is, are they the same? Are they synonymous, or are they complementary political philosophies? And could you explain what they are and their impact on how the world views, or let's stick with Europe because we're an organization. Let's stick with Europe here. How does it influence how European countries view themselves, view their role in the world, and view Israel?
Yeah, I definitely think that your point about how they are complementary is exactly what I would describe. So I wrote basically a definition of third worldism following the rise and the success of Mamdani in New York. And there were a lot of people making the argument that he's an Islamist, he's a terrorist, he's a jihadist, or he's a communist or a socialist. And I wrote a piece explaining that he's actually something a little bit more different. He's what I would call a third worldist, meaning that it doesn't matter whether it's socialism, communism that he will, or Islamism that he will lead on. What matters is that he fundamentally thinks that the United States is evil and should purify itself. And one of the ways it can purify itself is to declare that Israel is this great enemy of mankind. And this is, I think, very much what a lot of the colonial thinkers believe as well. Oh, sorry, my a lot of the colonial thinkers believe as well, and they wrote about it at length about how there is surrogate colonialism and how decolonization is the only way forward. And it's very interesting because in Middle East studies, this is what you hear a lot. A lot of people who study the Middle East or North Africa, there's this heavy focus on a conflict like the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's not even presented as in a factual manner. It's more presented as an ideological conflict, and the analysis is more a Marxist one, that there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed, and that Israelis are always the oppressors, no matter what they do. By the way, even if they give the money, even if they're the ones sending Palestinians to hospitals, etc., they're always the oppressors. And I think that this Marxist view obviously spread and being spread in universities is very powerful because when Mamdani was speaking to New Yorkers, he did not really just speak to Islamists. He also spoke to a lot of students who found that language very familiar, and they saw in him exactly what a teacher would tell them about the Israel-Palestine conflict. But the thing is, it doesn't just apply to Israel. Obviously, it also applies to Europe because. One of the major events of the 20th century was decolonization of Africa, and the 1968 protests and riots in Paris, where you find huge elite, intellectual elite, saying that France is an imperial state and needs to purify itself and needs to always look for ways to give and do whatever it takes for other countries to thrive, and that the average French person is guilty forever for what the state did. And I thought that you know, the Foucault, Sartre, and a lot of these writers wrote about these things that way. And obviously, it's being espoused in a lot of universities. So I think that this is, I think, the decolonial framework, but the third worldist one applies, and I made the distinction in the sense that in third worldism, what you need is just resentment. Decolonialism gives you some arguments for that, but in U.S. politics, I think that there's always this tendency to go towards a big tent, to go towards Islamists, for example, who hate the United States and think the United States is evil, to go to other groups who believe the same, and this revanchist, I'd say, sentiment can fuel enough of a group to promote the colonial framework or other policies. So it's too abstract, but I hope I made the point there, that there is also an ideological component that is making a lot of Americans espouse a lot of policies that are anti-America.
I thought this was important to discuss because over the last several months, I guess, or year, I've often responded to certain people's concerns about why isn't ELNET doing this, or why isn't APAC in the United States doing that, or kind of writ large, the Jewish community or pro-Israel communities need to do something. And I often respond by saying, it's interesting. The anti Semites and the philo Semites, or the anti Israel and the pro Israel communities, share one thing in common. They both attribute to the Jews and to the pro Israel community far more power than they actually have. We are contending with a civilizational conflict, an ideological conflict that, 0.002% of the world population is just not capable of responding to. And that's why I think understanding these ideological underpinnings of what we're seeing across the entire Western democratic world is so important for everybody to understand. Not that we shouldn't be doing things, we absolutely should, but it is far more complex, as I think you've just laid out, than what initial responses are. What I want to now turn to, which is sort of adjacent to it, is you also wrote a very interesting piece on the military, how do I say it? The militarization of Europe and the will to use it, or the will to fight. We, ELNET, have been intimately involved in the relationships between Israel and numerous European countries. Billion-dollar deal after billion-dollar deal between Germany and the Baltic states and Romania and Italy and others to enhance their defense capabilities and intelligence capabilities. But you raise a very interesting conundrum, which is, I think, goes directly to the decolonial and third worldist framework. Do the Europeans have the will to use it? Because at the core of it is about their identity as European countries. Can you explore that a little bit with us and help us understand how to tie these things together?
Yeah, sure. So I was very struck by a speech that a French general gave in front, I think, of city mayors or something of this sort.
Mhm.
And the general was simply saying, we are arming, we are doing this, we are doing that, and we need to be ready. We need to be ready for war. We need to be ready to lose our children and to lose family members. And it was an absolute controversy in France. Every single politician was saying that this is a horrific statement, that this should not be said. But I thought that this was a very revealing scene. That this is exactly, I think, the manifestation of Europe's greatest threat. And the threat is that there is a huge political will to militarize, to buy drones, to buy this defense system, to get this weapon system, to talk about NATO as this greatest organization that should be absolutely empowered. But when it comes to requiring sacrifice from citizens, then there is a huge blockage. And the simple question is that is a European today ready to die for Europe? And the answer is always now ambiguous. And I thought that this is a very, very big problem that politicians in Europe are simply not confronting. And it's a ticking bomb. Why? Because the threats are multiplying. The Russians are using every single opportunity to promote anti-EU, Europe anti-US messages, and they're simply not talking to their populations. They're simply not explaining the threats of doing nothing to the population. And so they are in this cocoon of comfort from outside threats, that everything is being handled by bureaucracies, etc. And I thought that this was a very big problem that the United States obviously cannot help with, and that European politicians will have to deal with at some point. And obviously this is I think a wider cultural issue, is that because of years of saying that Europe was responsible for every single catastrophe that happened in the world, which kind of is. I mean, there's a lot of all of the issues, historical ones, but the problem is making it an ideology that because Europe was the victim but also the responsible of these atrocities, it means we should do absolutely nothing. It means that Europeans should simply surrender, and they're not worthy of winning against their enemies. This is also a civic problem, I believe. For example, in French schools, there's this huge, you can find curriculums about French colonization and what France did in Africa, etc., which is not to deny. These are things that should be thought and everyone should be aware of. However, making the case that precisely because that happened, that it means that France should absolutely perish, I think it's a huge stretch and an ideologically very dangerous one. And so, yes, this is basically what I was what I was trying to explain in my piece, that there's a huge disparity in how we discuss countering threats and what Europe is willing to do for that.
Since you just mentioned French decolonialization, we do have a question from Fred McDonald, who wants to know about Algeria. Do you view Algeria favorably or unfavorably? Is it part of the solution or part of the problem?
Well, I think that Algeria is definitely part of the problem, in the sense that they have arrested one of the greatest writers, French writers, Boilim Sansal, and he only got out of prison after a year of pressure from Germany, and they actually pushed I think a legislation, a law, basically banning colonization or something of this sort, because the Kabyle Berbers have called for independence from a regime that did nothing but repress them and make sure they don't speak their language. Actually, Algeria is a very interesting case study, because because a lot of the decolonization discourse happened during the Algerian Civil War, but also War of Independence, and that it fueled a lot of I think ideological debates that are today very much relevant.
All right, I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we'll redirect it to participants' questions. So again, if you'd like a question asked, please submit it. All right, we have to discuss Saudi Arabia because it is a conundrum in the making. You wrote a wonderful piece. Again, I've read so many of your pieces, and I will call every one of them wonderful. But talking about MBS's perspective on normalization and Vision 2030, it's so many reasons why we thought Saudi Arabia was going in one direction. It seems to be pivoting now in the opposite direction, aligning with Turkey, aligning with Qatar, blowing up a UAE shipment to Yemen, standing up opposite of UAE on Somaliland, and now forming potentially a Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi defense pact, which would mimic NATO's Article 5, which is pretty significant. What is behind this? Why is MBS moving in this direction when there were so many hopeful reasons to think he was moving in the right direction?
Quite honestly, I think it comes from one very particular reason, and it's that the United States is not yet making it a real priority for Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize. And therefore, because there isn't this pressure, MBS is also calibrating his position in a way that he can benefit from every single U.S. agreement or partnership without normalizing with Israel, which actually means going in the side of Turkey as well. Turkey is not yet being called for a normalization with Israel and or for a cooperation with Israel and Syria. And because the United States is not making that a real priority and a real, I would say, condition for any type of engagement, obviously, a lot of the players in the Middle East are hedging. Also, there is another layer to this, which is that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have never seen eye to eye on Libya, on Syria to some extent, on Yemen, on Somalia. And because there was never a real cooperation between the two on those issues, well, Saudis see now a real opportunity to align with Turkey that has obviously that is a NATO member, but also has a lot of clout since its triumph in Syria to position itself against UAE's ambitions. And I think that this is something that, it's been the case since, I think, 2013, and it's dragged on, but because of the Abraham Accords, it's taking a turn that might not benefit the United States, which is why promoting projects such as the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that will lock in Saudi Arabia and Israel to work together and make sure that Saudis see the benefit of such a project is also a way to actually diffuse all of these tensions. Because the real threat in the Middle East is to have proxies from the IRGC benefiting from every single dispute that happens between U.S. allies in the region.
Just as a note, those of you who are return participants of the Monday briefing have heard us speak often of IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, of which Zineb just referenced, and it has been a key initiative of ours. And just a month or two ago, Italy, our Rome office, held a large symposium around IMEC. So thank you, Zineb, for bringing that up, because we too believe it is the horse in front of the cart that we think can actually bring the Middle East together. I still find it interesting that MBS would align with Erdogan rather than siding with the forces that seem to be winning this ideological fight right now. And so let me ask you this: is it unreasonable to think, or crazy to think, that we could see a new axis if the regime in Iran falls, which would be Israel, UAE, Iran versus Turkey, Saudis, and Qatar?
I wouldn't talk about Iran in that framework just because it can go either way.
Too
Um,
premature?
Yeah, so what I would say
Okay.
though is that yeah, I definitely see that Israel, UAE on one side, but the thing is that the Israelis themselves do not align with a lot of UAE's projects, for example, in Libya and other places. So it's very Somaliland focused. But for Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, they're definitely going towards that direction. And quite frankly, I think that the United States is the only one that can fix that because a lot of them, I mean, these are really just political tensions that are the product of U.S. and willingness to push forward when it comes to making normalization agreements the condition of every discussion they have with Washington. I remain a bit more optimistic on that front, but it's true. It's becoming that way, I would say.
Okay. I'm going to pause there just for a moment for an ELNET commercial. Everybody, we started a new year. Want to thank you for being with us today, and we assume you'll be with us all year. And if that's the case, if you're in a position to renew your support or start your support at the beginning of the year, it matters to us. It gives us an opportunity to know what's ahead of us. We can better plan for the challenges and opportunities that we want to take advantage of. It matters. And so if you're in a position right now to renew your Diplomacy Club support, please go to our website and do so. If you're ready to become a Diplomacy Club member because you're not already one, we urge you to do so. There are opportunities. The sands are shifting. And if you're reading the news, you know that Europe is going to matter more than ever to Israel in the coming years, if not the coming decade. And we need to be prepared with the resources to take on what's ahead of us. So with that, thank you very much. And let's go to some of your questions. John Mirish has a question about sort of Qatar's role in academia. Now, there's been a lot of publications lately about Qatar's undermining of the educational system, the funding. What more needs to be done to kind of extirpate Qatar from the role it's playing in the United States and certainly across Europe, if anything?
So I actually have a slight disagreement when it comes to understanding academia in the United States because Qatar actually finances different groups, and a lot of them are actually right now right-wing groups. A lot of them are I think Qatar finances Newsweek, that is a pro-Israel as well, but also other media. But anyway, I'm not very much sure about the Newsweek one, but just to say that the problem and the root is what these professors and what universities themselves propose as a curriculum. So when Qatar finances something, only finances what is already there. I have not seen yet or an organization coming up with a real Middle East curriculum that actually just shows things for what they are. I think Austin University has some sort of and also a university in Florida are doing a lot of work on that. But my point is, it's great to work against deterring foreign actors from taking advantage of of this fragmentation. But what I think is very much important to do is to come up with with an alternative, because the alternative right now is to go over the same things. Because even if you take out a lot of the money that these countries are giving, the curriculums will remain the same and the products will remain the same. I'm not sure if I'm pretty clear on that, but just to to give another example, for example, State Department right now is reviewing the Foreign Service exam. This is, for example, extremely important to counter a lot of the disinformation, a lot of the pre I would say the stereotypes that one just hears about the Middle East. These are reforms that stay. Also making sure that every single university has to disclose every single money they get from Qatar and Turkey and other countries. These are very important for transparency. So I think making structural changes is very, very important when it comes to countering anti-Semitism and countering also a lot of the anti-Israel discourse and presenting real alternatives that will outlast anything on that in that area.
I think you raise a fair point in that what I think you're saying is that Qatar is a problem. It's a big problem, but it's not the problem. And without those who are willing to espouse anti-American, anti-Semitic ideologies, something we just spent quite a bit of time discussing here, those who are so predisposed to decolonial framework and third worldism, the funding by Qatar would go nowhere. So while, yes, it's a problem that they're funding, it's actually the problem of these ideologies that seem to be seeping in and permeating U.S. and Western culture.
Yes, it's very also noticeable in how people consume, for example, media.
Mhm.
It's very interesting because I think this generation gets its news not through watching TV or reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They get their news from TikTok and Instagram. And so there is also that as well, that there needs to be also an effort in countering a lot of these anti-America, anti-Israel narratives through actually educating, because people are also starving and are thirsty for real data, for understanding things for what they are. And quite often they just don't know. I was very surprised, for example, to find out that I was talking to someone, they had no idea what Russia was doing in Africa. They're like, oh, why are they in Africa? Well, it's for a reason. They are trying to go after NATO, and one of the ways is to not just be on the Eastern Front, but also to be in the southern flank and push a migration crisis from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And they simply didn't know. So there is a lot of work to be done in that way, that prevents foreign actors, whether it's Qatar or Russia, China, or others, from seizing the opportunity.
Okay, so we have a few questions around Iran, and I'm going to package them. So, one, how do the Arab countries view regime change? Concerned or favorable or wait and see? Second one would be what would it take for the protest? Well, let me say it this way. Does the standing army in Iran have to take part, have to change sides for the protest to be fully successful? And then is a monarchy favorable, likely? Any thoughts on what the structure of the Iranian government should be?
Yeah, so for Arab countries, they're of course, I think, very worried because they don't want another Syria civil war scenario that will trigger other issues and smuggling and arms trafficking, etc. So there for a good reason they're very worried, I would say, but they also are in a wait and see mode because of Trump's unpredictability as well. It's really a matter of whether Trump decides that he's done with Khamenei or not. And I think that they are also in a wait and see mode. Regarding what will come next, from what I understand, U.S. foreign policy stance on this is to also wait and see. It seems that Trump is going to, if these protests end up completely destroying the regime, there are a few obvious scenarios. One of them is that you'll get an elite defection, but the IRGC will try to strike a deal, will be much more secular, much more open to the West. Make sure that oil flows, etc., and and a lot of conditions so that it can work with the United States. I think that's a scenario among others. But there's also this scenario where Reza Shah, I think that's sorry,
Reza
Pahlavi, yeah,
Pahlavi.
yeah, Reza Pahlavi would make a stance and will seize the opportunity. Who knows? I think he's also looking at that, and he's been very active, calling for protests and supporting them. So there's also that. But Trump said that he will wait and see that and see who will triumph in this. So these are the possibilities. But the thing that I am most worried about is that these protests will continue. Um, because for a very simple reason, I explained prior that the water crisis and the inflation and the capital flight are in such a the dire situation of the Iranian economy will only make this protest uh, more aggressive. Um, and that Khamenei will try to actually save face and by striking a deal with the United States. And that I think would be a very bad scenario. I think it's less likely, but it's a scenario among others that would be very bad, I think, for not just Iranians, but also for the West in general.
We are running a little low on time, so I'm going to ask one more question. This one from Larry Hochberg, who wants to know, and this gets to an earlier discussion we had about Trump's extraction of Maduro. And so he wants to know, do you think that Trump's actions give or allow Putin and Xi to act in similar ways? Do you think they will use his actions to move more or in Ukraine and then perhaps Taiwan? Or do you think it should be viewed entirely different by them?
Um, on Taiwan, I think that right now, every single move that the Trump administration is doing is about deterring China. I saw actually that a lot of analysts were saying how what Trump is doing is actually going to embolden Beijing, etc. But it's just not true. It actually means that the United States is willing to use all of the means and force to secure strategic choke points. So I think that the fact that they're going after Venezuela, they're making threats against Cuba and Colombia. They're also, I think people forget about what happened with South Africa. I mean, South Africa was so cornered, and they were uh, the United States was very explicit about the problems that South Africa was causing, even with the relationship with Israel. I mean, one of the reasons Israel is no longer an observer member of the African Union was because South Africa pushed a huge campaign against Israel, and now South Africa is reversing the trend, and they are trying to get in a better spot with Israel. I think they got a new embassy or something of this sort, and that just tells you how far and how deterrence works. So I think that this is really about restructuring U.S. the industrial and military capacity, which is something that Pete Hegseth is doing, but also reversing the balance of power so that it benefits the United States and its allies in case Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan.
Before I turn it over to Tom Flesch, chair of ELNET, I'd like to ask you one last question, which is, and if you could make it brief, what are you optimistic about? A lot's going on to make us concerned, and I'm sure all of us are. But what are you optimistic about?
I'm actually very optimistic about Ukraine. All of this is actually benefiting Ukraine, and it's amazing the amount of I think support that Ukrainians are getting from making sure that Russia and Venezuela cannot collaborate, making sure that Russia does not benefit from IRGC know-how when it comes to drones and other things. I think a lot because we were really at a turning point where China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran were going to start using Ukraine as a battlefield to test their systems against NATO standards. And I think that a lot of that is being slightly reversed. So I'm quite optimistic about Ukraine.
Okay. Well, Zineb, I want to thank you. This was a really in-depth, interesting discussion, and I appreciate you joining us.